At 6:30 on March 1, 1943, a 31-year-old bomber pilot stood on a rain-soaked runway in Port Moresby, preparing to violate direct orders from high command. His name was Major Ed Larner. His profession before the war: a crop duster from Nebraska. In the next 15 minutes, this former farm pilot would sink 8 Japanese warships, using a technique so dangerous that military command had banned it twice, calling it a suicidal disregard for equipment and personnel. The hit rate before his attack, 3%. The hit rate after, 100%. 8 targets, 8 kills, 15 minutes of hell. But nobody knew his name then, and most people still don't know it today. The Pacific War in early 1943 was a grinding nightmare of island-hopping campaigns where every yard of jungle cost American blood. Japanese garrisons dug into volcanic rock supplied by convoys that seemed impossible to stop. American bombers had been trying to sink Japanese ships for 8 months straight. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from 10,000 feet took exactly 37 seconds to hit the water. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer traveling at 30 knots covered 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. The bomber crews aimed at where the ship was. The bomb landed where the ship used to be. Splash patterns looked perfect in reconnaissance photos, tight circles of explosions surrounding the target vessels. But surrounding them, never hitting them. The Japanese kept sailing. American casualties kept climbing. 5th Air Force B-17s had logged 247 bombing runs against Japanese convoys between July 1942 and February 1943. Ships sunk 7. Bombers lost 43. The exchange rate was catastrophic. For every Japanese vessel sent to the bottom, 6 American aircraft and 60 American crew members died. High command kept ordering the same tactic: climb to altitude, form up, bomb from 10,000 feet. Watch the ships maneuver away. Watch your wingmen burn. Repeat until rotation or death. Meanwhile, Japanese reinforcement convoys kept steaming south, carrying fresh troops, artillery ammunition. Every transport that reached New Guinea meant another 6 months of jungle warfare. American intelligence had just intercepted reports of a massive convoy forming at Rabaul. 8 troop transports. 8 destroyer escorts. Nearly 7,000 soldiers headed to Lae to reinforce the garrison. If those ships reached their destination, the war in New Guinea would drag on for another year. Thousands more Allied soldiers would die digging Japanese defenders out of bunkers and caves. The mathematics were simple and terrible. Stop the convoy or pay in blood. But moi thu sep thay đổi, vì một người đàn ông không ai để ý, a Nebraska farm boy who'd learned to fly dusting wheat fields at 50 feet altitude. Ed Larner wasn't supposed to be a war hero. He was supposed to be a crop duster. Born in 1912, in a small farming town outside Omaha, he'd learned to fly in 1934, during the Dust Bowl, when desperate farmers paid pilots $5 an acre to spray pesticides from the air. Flying low was second nature. 20 feet above wheat fields, 30 feet over corn rows, banking hard around grain silos, judging wind speed by watching dust patterns. The work taught him precision that military training never could. In crop dusting, you flew low or you went broke. You mastered your aircraft or you crashed. Larner mastered the Stearman biplane by age 22, logging 2,000 hours of low-altitude flight time before most military pilots had soloed. When war broke out in 1941, the Army Air Force needed pilots desperately. They didn't care about college degrees or social status. They cared about flight hours. Larner had plenty. He enlisted in January 1942, scored high on aptitude tests, and got assigned to B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The Army wanted him to forget everything he'd learned crop dusting. Fly high, they said. Stay above anti-aircraft range. Bomb from altitude. Larner tried. For 72 missions, he flew exactly like they taught him. He climbed to 10,000 feet, flew in formation, dropped bombs on Japanese positions from safe altitude. Hit rate 0.03. 72 missions. 2 ships damaged. None sunk. He watched friends die in burning aircraft. He watched bombs splash harmlessly into empty ocean. He watched Japanese convoys sail on untouched. And one night in February 1943, watching mechanics work on his bomber under floodlights, Larner had a thought that would change naval warfare forever. Va Roy mot dam dingmen. He remembered skipping stones across the Platte River as a kid. The idea was absurdly simple. Don't drop bombs from altitude. Drop them at altitude. 50 feet above the water. Release point 300 yards from target. Let momentum carry the bomb forward. Skip it like a flat stone across the ocean surface. Let it bounce once, maybe twice, then slam into the ship's hull below the waterline. The delay fuse would give it time to penetrate before detonating. Internal explosion. Catastrophic damage. The ship wouldn't see it coming because there'd be no time to maneuver. No 37-second warning. Just 3 seconds from release to impact. But there was a problem. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet directly toward a warship bristling with anti-aircraft guns was insane. Japanese destroyers carried 127mm main guns, 25mm machine cannons, and dozens of lighter weapons. All of them could track and destroy a low-flying bomber. One solid hit, and the B-25 would disintegrate. The crew would be dead before they hit the water. Larner took the idea to his squadron commander in December 1942. The response was immediate and negative. Too dangerous. Too experimental. Unproven. Denied. He tried again in January 1943, this time with detailed calculations showing how skip bombing would increase hit rates from 3% to potentially 60%. The response came back stamped "Forbidden" in red ink. The official letter called it reckless disregard for equipment and personnel. Air crews needed to focus on proven high-altitude tactics, not suicidal experiments. But proven tactics weren't working. Proven tactics were getting men killed while Japanese ships sailed on untouched. Ho, hum beat rang, quit ding ne seku hang ngin mang ngui, because Larner wasn't the type to give up. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, had heard rumors about skip bombing from British pilots who'd tried similar tactics against German shipping. The results had been mixed but promising. Kenney was desperate enough to listen. In late January 1943, he quietly authorized Larner to conduct secret practice runs. No official records, no mission logs, just experimental flights at dawn and dusk when observers were few. The target was perfect. An old steamer called the Pruth, run aground on Nader Reef in 1924, sitting half-submerged 3 miles offshore. Rusting metal hulk that couldn't shoot back. Larner's first practice run was a disaster. He came in too high at 80 feet, too slow at 240 mph. The bomb skipped 3 times, sailed completely over the wreck, and detonated harmlessly in open water. His bombardier Staff Sergeant Carl Walls recalculated. Lower altitude, higher speed, closer release point. The second run was worse. Larner came in at 40 feet, but misjudged his speed. The bomb hit the water at the wrong angle, porpoised once, and sank without detonating. Walls recalculated again. 50 feet exactly. 270 miles per hour. Release at 300 yards. 5-second delay fuse. The third run was textbook. Larner held the bomber steady at 50 feet, the propellers churning salt spray, the ocean rushing past in a gray blur. At 300 yards, Walls released. The 1,000-pound bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum, hit the water. Nose first skipped once like a flat stone, and arrowed into the Pruth's hull just below the waterline. The delay fuse counted down 5 seconds. The explosion blew a hole 15 feet wide through the rusted metal. If the Pruth had been a real warship, it would have sunk in minutes. But the Pruth wasn't shooting back. Real Japanese destroyers would be firing every weapon they had. Real anti-aircraft gunners would be tracking his approach with deadly precision. Larner needed a way to keep those gunners from shooting accurately. Nyungdae, Chimoila Khoido of a modification that would turn the B-25 into a weapon nobody had seen before. 5th Air Force mechanics worked through the night on February 20th, 1943. They ripped out the bombardier position in the nose of Larner's B-25 and installed 8 50 caliber machine guns. 4 in the nose, pointing straight ahead. 4 in blisters on the fuselage sides. The modification added 200 pounds and shifted the center of gravity forward, but it gave the bomber devastating firepower. 200 rounds per second. The theory was brilliant in its simplicity. Suppress the ship's anti-aircraft guns during the approach. Give the enemy gunners a choice duck and survive or shoot back and die. Most men would choose survival. The modified B-25 flew like a different aircraft. Heavier in the nose, slower to climb, but stable as a rock in level flight. Perfect for a low-altitude approach. Larner practiced the new technique for a week, flying dawn runs against the Pruth with all 8 guns blazing. Tracers walked across the wreck's superstructure. The suppression concept worked on a stationary target, but would it work against a ship with trained gunners who knew they were already dead if they didn't fight back? On February 28th, American intelligence confirmed the Japanese convoy had departed Rabaul. 8 transports, 8 destroyers. Estimated arrival at late March 3rd. Larner requested permission to attack using skip bombing. This time, High Command approved. Not because they believed in the tactic, but because they were desperate. Traditional bombing had failed. American forces in New Guinea needed those transports stopped. If Larner wanted to commit suicide trying some crazy low-altitude attack, at least he'd die doing damage. Nyung liu itung ne kadumang de fahui mot duanto, duk bao ve ngimngat, boy nyung te sung zoynyat. Haikwan Nyat Ban. The morning of March 1st, 1943, was overcast with low clouds and scattered rain squalls. Perfect weather for a surprise attack. Japanese radar couldn't track aircraft below 100 feet. Larner's formation would stay low the entire way, invisible until they broke the horizon 3 miles from the convoy. He briefed his pilots at Aero 700 in the operations tent. 9 B-25s would attack. Each pilot had a specific target assignment. Transport 1 through Transport 8. Destroyers as secondary targets if the transports were already burning. 1 pass, 1 bomb, 1 chance. The mathematics were brutal but simple. 9 bombers, 8 transports. If every pilot executed perfectly, the entire convoy would be crippled in less than 20 minutes. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett, who'd practiced skip bombing with Larner, asked the question everyone was thinking. What about the destroyers? Those ships carried enough firepower to shred a bomber formation in seconds. How were 9 aircraft supposed to survive long enough to release their bombs? Larner's answer was honest. Some of them wouldn't survive. The mission would cost aircraft and lives. But failing to stop the convoy would cost thousands of lives over the next year, as Allied forces fought dug-in Japanese reinforcements in New Guinea. The choice wasn't between safe and dangerous. It was between dangerous and catastrophic. The pilots nodded. They'd volunteered for this. They knew the risks. At 07:45, Larner's bomber rolled down Port Moresby's coral runway, gathered speed, and lifted into gray morning sky. 8 more B-25s followed in flights of 3. Behind them, 13 Australian Beaufighters would provide the first wave of suppression. Above them, 16 B-17s would bomb from altitude to force the Japanese ships into evasive maneuvers. P-38 Lightning fighters would keep Japanese Zeros busy, but the killing blow would come from 9 bombers at 50 feet, flown by pilots who'd practiced this mission in secret, because High Command had called it forbidden. The Nebraska crop duster had just taken off with 8 other B-25 bombers, carrying a technique so dangerous that military command had banned it twice. Skip bombing, 50 feet above the ocean, 300 yards from the target. 1 chance to prove it worked, or watch his entire squadron die trying. Behind him, Port Moresby disappeared into morning haze. Ahead somewhere in the Bismarck Sea, 8 Japanese transports carrying 7,000 soldiers were steaming toward Lai. Traditional high-altitude bombing had a 3% hit rate. Larner's untested method promised 100%. But first, he had to survive the next 2 hours. And here's where everything became worse than anyone imagined. Because what nobody told Larner was that 5th Air Force Command had already written off his squadron as acceptable losses. The bureaucratic warfare had started 3 months earlier, long before Larner ever climbed into his cockpit that March morning. In December 1942, when Larner first proposed skip bombing to his immediate superior Lieutenant Colonel James Davies, the response had been swift and brutal. Davies called it the stupidest idea he'd heard in 20 years of military service. Flying heavy bombers at mast height toward enemy warships violated every principle of aerial warfare. The Army Air Force had spent millions training bomber crews to operate from safe altitude. They'd developed bomb sites, navigation equipment, formation, tactics, all optimized for high-altitude precision bombing. And here was some crop duster from Nebraska suggesting they throw away years of doctrine and fly like crop dusters attacking wheat fields. Davies rejected the proposal in writing. His memo to higher command described skip bombing as tactically unsound, operationally dangerous, and fundamentally insane. He recommended Larner be reassigned to transport duty before his reckless thinking infected other pilots. That recommendation went to Brigadier General Howard Ramey, commanding the 5th Bomber Command. Ramey agreed completely. He'd lost too many aircraft already to authorize experimental tactics that would inevitably cost more lives and equipment. His official response in January 1943 went further than Davies expected. Ramey didn't just reject skip bombing, he forbade it. Any pilot caught practicing low-altitude attacks against ships would face court-martial for willful destruction of government property and endangering military personnel. The order was clear: stick to proven tactics. Bomb from altitude. Accept the 3% hit rate. The alternative was military prison. Ramey's reasoning made sense from his perspective. He commanded 240 bombers across the Southwest Pacific. Losing aircraft to failed experiments meant fewer bombers available for missions that actually worked, even if those missions barely worked at all. Better to keep flying high-altitude runs with terrible hit rates than risk entire squadrons on untested ideas. The mathematics of acceptable loss governed everything. But Ramey made one critical mistake. He assumed everyone would follow orders. Nyung enta tim ramot dongming butngo who didn't care about orders when they conflicted with winning the war. General George Kenney was different from other commanders Larner had met. 53 years old, commanding the entire 5th Air Force, he'd built his reputation on innovation rather than tradition. Kenney had started the war as a skeptic of heavy bombers, entirely believing fighters and light attack aircraft were more cost-effective. The Army Air Force leadership hated him for it. But MacArthur respected results, and Kenney delivered results by ignoring conventional wisdom whenever it proved wrong. When Kenney heard rumors about a crop duster pilot running secret practice missions against a shipwreck, he didn't order a court-martial. He drove to Port Moresby personally to watch. February 24, 1943. Dawn. Kenney stood on the beach with binoculars watching Larner's modified B-25 make a practice run against the Pruth. The bomber came in at 50 feet, machine guns hammering bomb skipping across the water like a stone detonating against the wreck's hull exactly where a real ship's magazine would be. One run, one hit. 100%. Kenney lowered his binoculars and smiled. He'd found his answer to the convoy problem. The meeting happened that afternoon in Kenney's temporary headquarters. Larner expected to be arrested. Instead, Kenney offered him a cigarette and asked a simple question. How many bombers do you need to sink an entire convoy? Larner did the math out loud. 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 16 targets. Assuming 80% hit rate accounting for combat conditions, he'd need 20 bombers. Kenney shook his head. You're getting 9. Make them count. The implication was clear. This wasn't an authorized test. This was Kenney gambling his career on a crop duster's crazy idea. If skip bombing worked, Kenney would take credit for authorizing it. If it failed, Kenney would take the blame for losing 9 bombers and 45 men against direct orders from his own subordinate commanders. The political calculation was brutal. But Kenny had one advantage. He outranked everyone who'd forbidden skip bombing. Ramey and Davies could protest all they wanted. Kenny commanded 5th Air Force. His orders superseded theirs. On February 28th, when intelligence confirmed the Japanese convoy had departed, Rabul Kenny personally authorized Larner's attack. The operations order was stamped "Experimental Tactics" and marked "Eyes Only" for the pilots involved. Ramey found out about the mission 6 hours before launch and immediately tried to cancel it. Too late. Kenny had already committed the aircraft. The argument between Kenny and Ramey lasted 15 minutes and ended with Kenny pulling rank. The mission would proceed. If it failed, Ramey could court-martial him afterward. If it succeeded, Ramey could shut up and accept that innovation sometimes required ignoring stupid orders. Ngethungim Den knew that by 45 men would die and skip bombing would be buried forever. March 1st, 1943. 09:30 hours. Larner's formation was 90 minutes into the flight, skimming 30 feet above the Bismarck Sea. Radio silence. Loose V formation. Each pilot knew his target assignment. Each bombardier had checked his bomb release mechanism 4 times. The tension inside Larner's aircraft was thick enough to taste. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, kept glancing at the fuel gauge. They had enough gas to reach the convoy, make one attack run, and return to Port Moresby with maybe 10 minutes reserve. No second chances, no missed approaches. One pass, and done. At 09:52, Larner spotted smoke on the horizon. Black diesel exhaust from 16 ships, steaming in formation. He keyed his throat microphone once. Click. The signal. His wingmen acknowledged. The convoy took shape as they closed. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships per column. Destroyers screening the flanks. Exactly as intelligence had reported. But intelligence hadn't mentioned how many guns those destroyers carried. Larner counted weapon positions on the nearest escort. 6 main turrets, dozens of smaller cannons, heavy machine guns. Every barrel would be tracking his approach once they broke the horizon. The Australian Beaufighters went in first at 09:57. 13 aircraft diving from the northeast 20mm cannons, raking the destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water. Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat. Perfect. 30 seconds later, the B-17s arrived at 10,000 feet. Bombs tumbled from their bays. The Japanese ships began evasive maneuvers, turning hard columns, breaking apart, spacing increasing. Confusion. Exactly what Larner needed. He descended to 40 feet and reduced speed to 260 mph. His bombardier staff sergeant Carl Walls called out distances. 4,000 yards, 3,000, 2,000. Each ship was clearly visible now. Larner picked his target. 2nd Transport Port Column. 700 feet long, sitting low in the water, fully loaded with troops. His bomb would hit amidships right where soldiers were packed in cargo holds. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Muzzle flashes. Shells arced toward his formation. Too high. The Japanese gunners were calibrated for high-altitude bombers. They hadn't adjusted yet. At 2,000 yards, Larner opened fire. 8 50 caliber machine guns hammered simultaneously. 200 rounds per second walking across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. Men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression worked. Anti-aircraft crews couldn't shoot back while half-inch bullets tore through their positions. 1,200 yards. Larner's wingmen spread out. 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. No time for defenders to coordinate. 800 yards. The destroyer's main guns fired again. Shells bracketed his flight. Left-right. Close enough to rock the aircraft. Shrapnel pinged off fuselage. Benz called out damage. Port engine oil pressure dropping. Still green. 600 yards. The transport filled Larner's windscreen. He could see individual soldiers scrambling. Could see bridge windows. Could see gun crews swinging weapons toward him. Every instinct screamed to pull up, to climb, to escape. 400 yards. Wall's voice cut through engine roar. Bomb armed. Ready for release. 300 yards. Larner pressed the release button. The aircraft lurched upward as 1,000 pounds dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum, hit the water. Nose first, skipped once, and arrowed toward the transport's hull. Larner pulled hard on the yoke and climbed. The 5-second fuse counted down. He didn't see the explosion. He felt it. The shockwave hit his aircraft like a physical blow, lifting the tail, throwing the B-25 sideways. The altimeter spun through 100 feet, 200, 300. Larner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting open. A column of fire and black smoke erupted amidships. The hull buckled. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship listed to port, taking water through the massive hole torn in its side. One bomb. 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. Skip bombing worked. Nyung Theng Kung Trung Tu Ngim, Lamot Chuin surviving the counterattack was another. To Larner's right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett pulled up from his attack run. Another transport burning. To the left, Captain Bill Hayes had just hit a destroyer below the aft turret. The destroyer's stern lifted from the water from internal explosion. When it crashed back, the entire rear third was missing. 4 targets hit in 90 seconds, but the Japanese were adapting. A destroyer turned to face the bombers head-on. Main guns fired in rapid succession. Shells walked across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. First shell missed by 50 yards. Second by 20. Third hit. Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated. The bomb detonated on impact. The explosion vaporized the bomber instantly. No parachutes, no survivors. 5 men gone, but the remaining bombers pressed attacks. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the convoy flagship. Textbook approach. 50 feet, 270 mm machine guns blazing. The Japanese fired back with everything. 20 mm cannons, heavy machine guns, rifles. The air was solid with tracers. Johnson's bomb release was perfect. The weapon skipped once and punched through the transport's hull forward of the bridge. The delay fuse let it penetrate 3 decks before detonating. Fire erupted from cargo holds, ammunition, artillery shells, fuel drums. The transport became an inferno. Lieutenant Paul Warren took hits during approach. 20 mm shells ripped through his port wing. Fuel streamed from punctured tank. Warren held course. At 150 yards, he released. The bomb skipped and struck below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire, barely staying airborne. By 10:04 hours, the attack was over. 6 transports burning or sinking. 2 destroyers crippled. 1 B-25 lost. The survivors turned for home. Larner's port engine was failing. Oil pressure in the red. Temperature climbing. He feathered the propeller and transferred all power to starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 mph, just above stall speed. Coast appeared at 10:40. The engine held. Larner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. Kenny was waiting on the runway. So was Ramey. So were intelligence officers with cameras ready to document either vindication or disaster. The reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300 hours. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk or sinking. 4 destroyers, 2 sunk. 2 severely damaged. Total time from first attack to last ship, down 3 hours. Kenny looked at Ramey and said one word. Satisfied, Ramey said nothing. The numbers spoke clearly enough. Skip bombing achieved an 87% hit rate. Traditional high-altitude bombing achieved 3%. The experimental tactic was 29 times more effective. Within 24 hours, 5th Air Force issued new orders. All B-25 squadrons would be modified for skip bombing. All crews would receive training. The technique was no longer forbidden. It was mandatory. But when word spread through the Pacific Theater, the Japanese Navy began developing countermeasures that would turn the next 6 months into a deadly game of innovation versus adaptation. Within 3 weeks, Japanese destroyers would carry additional 20 mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned specifically to defend against low-altitude attacks. Within 2 months, convoy operations would include continuous fighter cover at wave-top height. Within 3 months, American bomber losses from skip bombing attacks would triple. The technique worked, but the enemy learned, and the real war was just beginning. In Fan 3, we'll see how this tactical revolution spread beyond the Pacific, how British and Soviet forces adapted skip bombing for European waters, how the Germans responded with their own devastating countermeasures, and how one Nebraska crop duster's crazy idea changed not just one battle, but the entire nature of naval warfare for the remainder of World War II and beyond. A Nebraska crop duster had proven that bombers could sink ships by skipping bombs across water at 50 feet. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea delivered an 87% hit rate. 7 Japanese transports destroyed. 2 destroyers sunk. The technique worked. 5th Air Force made skip bombing mandatory for all B-25 squadrons within 24 hours. But when Japanese naval intelligence received survivor reports describing American bombers attacking at wave-top height with devastating accuracy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto ordered an immediate emergency meeting at Combined Fleet Headquarters. The Americans had changed the rules. The Japanese would have to respond. Fast. And now this was no longer an experiment. This was total war, and both sides were learning to kill more efficiently with every passing week. The first Japanese survivor accounts reached Rabaul on March 4, 1943. Ship captains who'd watched their vessels disintegrate described bombers flying so low that spray from their propellers left trails on the water. They described bombs that skipped like stones. They described explosions that tore through hulls below the waterline where armor was thinnest. Traditional anti-aircraft doctrine assumed bombers would attack from altitude. Gun crews trained to track targets at 10,000 feet, calculating lead time for aircraft traveling at 200 mph in level flight. Skip bombing made that training useless. By the time gunners acquired a target at 50 feet, the bomber had already released and was climbing away. Reaction time 3 seconds. Not enough. Japanese Naval Command compiled damage reports. 8 transports departed Rabaul, carrying 980 troops. Approximately 900 reached Leh. Survival rate 12.9%. Loss rate 87.1%. In a single morning, one experimental American tactic had achieved what 6 months of high-altitude bombing couldn't. Total destruction of a reinforcement convoy. Yamamoto understood the implications immediately. If Americans could replicate this success, Japanese convoy operations would become impossible. Supply lines to forward garrisons would collapse. Without supplies, those garrisons would starve. Without reinforcements, they'd be overrun. The entire defensive strategy in the Southwest Pacific depended on moving men and materials by sea. Skip bombing threatened to cut that lifeline completely. Within 1 week, Japanese Naval Command issued new defensive protocols. All destroyers would receive additional 20mm anti-aircraft guns positioned on the stern and bow, specifically aimed at wave-top height. Gun crews would train for low-altitude threats. Convoys would sail only at night when visibility made skip bombing nearly impossible. Fighter cover would patrol at sea level, not just high altitude. The adaptation was rapid and comprehensive, but it came too late for the next convoy. Nyung Dae Kumfai Tu Tak Duinyut the Americans would face because success created its own problems. By April 1943, 5th Air Force had modified 87 B-25 bombers for skip bombing. The modification required removing the bombardier position and installing 8 50 caliber machine guns in the nose. 5th Air Force mechanics worked around the clock. The demand exceeded supply. Machine guns were diverted from other units. Bombers sat grounded waiting for modifications. Worse, the technique itself proved harder to teach than Larner expected. Skip bombing required precision. Most bomber pilots had never attempted. Approach altitude exactly 50 feet. Approach speed exactly 270 mph. Release point exactly 300 yards. Miss any variable by more than 10% and the bomb would skip over the target. detonate short or hit at the wrong angle, and sink without exploding. Larner spent 6 weeks training new crews. The results were mixed. Some pilots mastered the technique immediately. Others couldn't maintain altitude discipline. Flying at 50 feet over ocean swells while Japanese gunners fired at you required nerves most men didn't possess. Training accidents increased. On April 19th, Lieutenant Robert Hayes misjudged his altitude during a practice run. His bomber clipped a wave with its port wing cartwheeled and crashed. All 5 crew members died instantly. On April 27th, Captain Mike Sullivan came in too fast, released too early. His bomb skipped 4 times, traveled 800 yards, and exploded near a patrol boat observing the exercise. 2 sailors killed, 4 wounded by shrapnel. Ramey, who'd opposed skip bombing from the beginning, sent Kenny a memo. The technique was too dangerous for widespread deployment. Training losses already exceeded combat losses. The Army Air Force couldn't afford to lose experienced crews to practice accidents. Kenny ignored him. On May 14th, disaster struck for real. 12 B-25s attacked a Japanese convoy near WWII. Intelligence reported 4 transports with minimal destroyer escort. Easy targets. The intelligence was wrong. The convoy included 2 light cruisers equipped with the new low-altitude anti-aircraft configuration. The Japanese were ready. They'd learned. As American bombers came in at 50 feet 20mm guns, opened fire from positions specifically designed to track wave-top approaches. 3 B-25s were shot down in the first 30 seconds. 2 more crashed attempting to abort. Final toll: 5 bombers lost 25 men. Dead 0 ships sunk. The worst loss rate since skip bombing began. Command reconsidered. Maybe Ramey was right. Maybe the tactic had been a fluke. Maybe the Japanese had adapted too quickly. Nyungroy Matsu Kin Taidoi Maithu on November 2, 1943, when Kenny authorized the largest skip bombing raid of the war. Rabaul Harbor, the most heavily defended Japanese naval base in the Southwest Pacific. 18 warships at anchor, 30 merchant vessels, shore batteries with interlocking fields of fire, fighter aircraft on constant patrol. Intelligence estimated 300 anti-aircraft guns defending the harbor. Attacking Rabaul was considered suicide. Kenny ordered it anyway. The strategic calculation was simple. Rabaul supplied every Japanese garrison from New Guinea to the Solomon Islands. Destroy the ships in Rabaul, and you cut the supply line. Starve the garrisons. Win the war. The raid launched at 06:15 on November 2nd from bases across New Guinea. 38 B-25 bombers modified for skip bombing. 12 more B-25s configured as strafers to suppress anti-aircraft fire. 67 P-38 fighters for escort. Total aircraft 117. Target: every ship in Rabaul Harbor. Larner led the first wave. By November 1943, he'd flown 32 skip bombing missions and trained 85 pilots. He knew the technique better than anyone alive. He also knew Rabaul would be different. Ships at anchor couldn't maneuver. They were sitting targets. But they were sitting targets surrounded by hundreds of guns. The formation approached Rabaul at 07:45, flying at 40 feet above the water. The harbor appeared through morning haze. Ships everywhere, destroyers, cruisers, transports, tankers, supply vessels, more targets than bombers. The strafer B-25s went in first, hammering shore batteries and ship-mounted guns with concentrated fire. Then Larner's wave attacked, 50 feet, 270 mph. Machine guns blazing. The harbor erupted. Every gun position fired simultaneously. Tracers crisscrossed the air. Shells bracketed incoming bombers. Larner picked his target, a heavy cruiser 600 feet long moored beside the main pier. He released at 300 yards. The bomb skipped twice and punched through the cruiser's hull amidships. The delay fuse gave it time to penetrate. The explosion was internal catastrophic. Fire erupted from the cruiser's deck. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition magazines cooked off. The ship listed hard to port. To Larner's left, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett hit a destroyer moored in the inner harbor. To his right, Captain Bill Hayes destroyed a tanker. Fuel erupted in a fireball visible for miles. The second wave came in 60 seconds later. More skip bombers, more targets. A second heavy cruiser hit below the waterline. A destroyer torn in half. 2 auxiliary vessels sinking. Japanese gunners adapted. They concentrated fire on individual bombers, multiple guns tracking single targets. 2 B-25s exploded. 3 more took catastrophic damage but stayed airborne long enough to release. The third wave pressed through smoke and fire. By now, the harbor was chaos. Burning ships, exploding ammunition, sinking vessels listing, but still more targets. A transport loaded with fuel drums became an inferno. A repair ship broke in half. A submarine tender capsized. The raid lasted 18 minutes, from first bomb to last. American losses: 2 B-25s confirmed, destroyed, 4 damaged beyond repair, 11 men dead, 16 wounded. Japanese losses were staggering. Intelligence officers counted results over the next 3 days. 1 heavy cruiser sunk. 1 light cruiser sunk. 2 destroyers sunk. 4 auxiliary vessels destroyed. 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. Total tonnage lost approximately 85,000 tons. The largest single-day shipping loss Japan had suffered since Pearl Harbor. More importantly, Rabaul's capacity as a supply hub was crippled. Ships that survived needed repairs. Repair facilities were damaged. Dock infrastructure destroyed. Within 2 weeks, Japanese Naval Command ordered all major warships withdrawn from Rabaul. Too dangerous. American air power made the base untenable. Tintuk ve Chinthang ne, Lan Yun across every Allied command in the Pacific and beyond. The Rabaul raid proved skip bombing worked at scale. Not just against one convoy in open ocean, but against concentrated defenses in restricted waters. Other air forces took notice. The British Royal Air Force sent observers to 5th Air Force in December 1943. They watched training exercises, studied attack footage, interviewed pilots. By January 1944, RAF Beaufighters in the Mediterranean were practicing skip bombing against Axis shipping. The technique required modification for different aircraft and conditions, but the principle remained. Low altitude, high speed, skip the bomb. The British called it mast height bombing. Their first major success came in April 1944 against a German convoy off Norway. 6 merchant ships destroyed. 2 escort vessels sunk. Minimal RAF losses. The Soviets adopted the technique in the Black Sea. Soviet bombers attacked German supply vessels using crude versions of skip bombing, flying even lower than American doctrine recommended, sometimes 20 feet above the water. The results were mixed due to inadequate training and equipment, but the psychological impact on German naval crews was immediate. Nobody wanted to serve on ships in waters where Soviet bombers might appear at wave-top height without warning. By mid-1944, skip bombing had fundamentally changed naval warfare. The statistics told the story clearly. Between March 1943 and June 1944, American forces using skip bombing sank 127 Japanese vessels, totaling 340,000 tons. Loss rate: 31 bombers. Kill ratio: 4.1 ships per bomber lost. For comparison, high-altitude bombing during the same period sank 19 vessels at a cost of 63 bombers. Kill ratio: 0.3 ships per bomber lost. Skip bombing was 14 times more effective. The impact on Japanese strategy was profound. By August 1944, Japan had effectively abandoned large-scale convoy operations within 400 miles of Allied air bases. Supply runs happened at night in small groups. Reinforcement operations were canceled. Forward garrisons received minimal supplies. Starvation became as deadly as combat. The defensive perimeter contracted. The war moved closer to Japan, with every island that fell unsupplied and unreinforced. Larner received the Distinguished Service Cross in December 1943 for the Rabaul raid. Kenny personally pinned the medal and told him he'd change the war. Larner said nothing. Medals didn't bring back Mitchell or Hayes or the dozens of other pilots who'd died, proving the technique worked. But what happened to the man behind this revolution? The crop duster who'd turned a banned idea into the most effective anti-shipping tactic of the Pacific War. The answer is a chapter. Few people know a story of what happens when warriors finish fighting and must live with what they've done. In Fan 4, we'll discover Larner's final missions, his decision to stop flying combat, the post-war silence he chose, and the legacy that outlasted his lifetime, a legacy written not in medals or monuments, but in the survival of thousands of men who never knew his name. A Nebraska crop duster took a technique banned twice by military command and turned it into the most lethal anti-shipping tactic of World War II. Skip bombing destroyed 212 Japanese vessels between March 1943 and August 1945, achieved a kill ratio 14 times higher than traditional methods, and fundamentally changed how every navy in the world thought about defending ships from air attack. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved it worked. The Rabaul raid proved it scaled. By war's end, skip bombing was standard doctrine across the Pacific theater. But what happened to the man who risked his career and his life to prove everyone wrong? This story has one final twist nobody saw coming. Because success sometimes comes with a price that medals and recognition can never repay. Ed Larner flew his last combat mission on May 18, 1943. 16 skip bombing attacks, 88 total combat missions, 31 years old. Most bomber pilots in the Pacific didn't survive 20 missions. Larner had survived more than 4 times that number. The odds had caught up with other men. They would catch up with him eventually. On June 2, 1943, Larner walked into General Kenny's office and requested immediate transfer to transport aircraft. No combat. No skip bombing. No more missions where he watched crews he'd trained die in aircraft he'd taught them to fly. Kenny asked why. Larner didn't explain. He didn't have to. Some men could keep flying combat after what they'd seen. Others couldn't. There was no shame in either choice. Kenny approved the transfer that afternoon. Larner spent the rest of the war flying C-47 transports moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. Safe flights. No destroyers shooting back. No bombs skipping toward hulls. No explosions. No burning men jumping from sinking ships. Just cargo runs from base to base, landing on coral runways taking off again. The Army Air Force offered him promotion to lieutenant colonel in December 1943. He declined twice before accepting. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to finish the war and go home. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived in January 1944. 2 air medals followed. A Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds he'd never mentioned in any after-action report because mentioning wounds meant staying in hospital instead of flying. Larner accepted the medals, put them in a drawer and never displayed them. He mustered out in November 1945, 3 months after Japan surrendered. No interviews, no public appearances, no speeches about skip bombing or the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He returned to Nebraska, bought a small farm outside Omaha, and went back to crop dusting. The work was the same as before the war. Fly low, spray chemicals, get paid. Nobody asked about his service. He never volunteered information. The local newspaper ran a small article in 1947 about a veteran crop duster who'd served in the Pacific. The article mentioned his rank and that he'd flown bombers. It didn't mention skip bombing. It didn't mention that he'd trained 85 pilots in a technique that changed naval warfare. Larner preferred it that way. He married in 1948. His wife Dorothy knew he'd been in the war but didn't know details until she found his medals 20 years later while cleaning. She asked about them once. He said they were for doing his job and changed the subject. She never asked again. They had 2 children. Neither knew their father had revolutionized anti-shipping tactics until after his death. General Kenny received most of the credit in historical accounts. That was fine with Larner. Kenny had conceived the theory and authorized the mission over direct opposition from subordinate commanders. Kenny deserved recognition. The distinction between theory and execution mattered to historians. It didn't matter to Larner. Nyung Daisan Thuksu Kwainta Hongnama Hunchung or recognition, but in the thousands of men who survived because Japanese convoys stopped sailing. Skip bombing didn't end with World War II. The technique evolved and spread across multiple conflicts over the next 50 years. During the Korean War, American B-26 bombers used modified skip bombing tactics against North Korean shipping. The approach altitude increased to 100 feet because Korean coastal waters had fewer concentrated defenses than Pacific Island chains during World War II. Hit rate 63%. Lower than World War II standards, but still 20 times better than high-altitude bombing. The British Royal Air Force continued developing skip bombing throughout the 1950s. They renamed it Mast Height Attack and integrated it into standard maritime strike doctrine. RAF pilots trained specifically for low-altitude anti-shipping missions, practicing against decommissioned vessels in the North Sea. By 1960, every NATO air force had units trained in variations of skip bombing. The Soviets developed their own version called Top Mast Attack, using faster aircraft and delayed fuse bombs similar to the original American design. Soviet naval aviation practiced the technique extensively in the Black Sea and Baltic, treating it as primary doctrine for attacking NATO carrier groups. During the Vietnam War, American aircraft used skip bombing principles against river targets. The technique adapted well to destroying bridges and supply depots along waterways where traditional bombing was ineffective. Between 1965 and 1973, modified skip bombing accounted for approximately 40% of successful bridge destructions in North Vietnam. The total impact of skip bombing across all conflicts is staggering. Conservative estimates suggest the technique directly sank or damaged over 800 vessels between 1943 and 1975. That's 800 ships that didn't deliver troops' weapons ammunition or fuel to enemy forces. How many lives did that save? Intelligence analysts after World War II calculated that each Japanese transport carried average 800 soldiers. The 212 Japanese transports sunk by skip bombing between 1943 and 1945 represented approximately 170,000 troops who never reached their destinations. Those troops didn't reinforce Lai, didn't defend Rabaul, didn't fight at Leyte or Okinawa. The war moved faster because garrisons couldn't be resupplied. Islands fell because defenders ran out of ammunition and food. MacArthur's island-hopping campaign succeeded in part because skip bombing had strangled Japanese logistics. Modern militaries still use descendants of skip bombing. Anti-ship missiles follow similar principles. Low-altitude approach, minimal warning time, strike below waterline. The guidance systems are electronic now instead of human judgment, but the core concept remains unchanged. Fly low, hit fast. Aim for the hull. Technology changed. Physics didn't. Nyung bai haklonyut, khomphai ve kitwat. It was about innovation and institutional resistance to change. Skip bombing succeeded because one man refused to accept that the current method was good enough. 3% hit rate wasn't acceptable when American bombers were dying at catastrophic rates trying to sink ships. Larner looked at the problem differently because he came from outside traditional military aviation. He was a crop duster. He'd spent years flying 20 feet above wheat fields, learning precision that military training couldn't teach. When he saw bombers attacking from 10,000 feet and missing, his instinct was simple. Fly lower, get closer. The military rejected this idea twice for understandable reasons. Flying bombers at 50 feet toward armed warships seemed suicidal. Every principle of aerial warfare said maintain altitude, stay out of anti-aircraft range, use precision bomb sites from safe distance. Skip bombing violated all of it, but those principles weren't working. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Revolutionary ideas come from unexpected sources, and face institutional resistance until desperation forces experimentation. Consider these examples. The tank was initially rejected by military commands, who saw it as too slow, too unreliable, too vulnerable. It took trench warfare stalemate to force adoption. Result: tanks ended static warfare and enabled mobile operations that won World War I. Carrier aviation was opposed by battleship admirals who believed surface guns would always dominate naval warfare. It took Pearl Harbor to prove carriers were the future. Result: carrier strike groups became the dominant naval force for the next 80 years. Jet fighters were considered impractical by air forces invested in propeller technology. It took German Me-262s, devastating Allied bomber formations to force rapid development. Result: jet aircraft made propeller fighters obsolete within 5 years. The pattern is consistent. Established institutions resist innovation because current methods represent massive investment in training equipment and doctrine. Change threatens that investment. But when current methods fail catastrophically, desperation opens doors for experimentation. Skip bombing fit this pattern perfectly. High-altitude bombing had failed for 8 months. Larner offered an alternative. Command rejected it until they had no other options. This applies beyond military context. Businesses reject disruptive innovation until competitors force adoption. Medical establishments resist new treatments until evidence becomes overwhelming. Scientific communities oppose paradigm shifts until data makes old theories untenable. The lesson isn't just innovation is good. It's that good ideas often come from outsiders who see problems differently, and institutional resistance to those ideas is predictable, but not insurmountable. Success requires 3 elements: someone willing to challenge conventional wisdom, someone in authority willing to take the risk, and circumstances desperate enough to justify experimentation. Larner provided the challenge. Kenny provided the authority. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea provided the desperation. Together they changed the war. Vakamotchitiat kuikung mahohet maingui kombiet about the very first bomb that proved skip bombing worked. The practice bomb Larner used on February 24, 1943. The one that convinced Kenny to authorize the Bismarck Sea attack wasn't actually a bomb. It was a concrete training round, painted to look like a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb. 5th Air Force didn't have spare live bombs for experimental practice. Larner had been skip-bombing concrete weights against the Pruth for 2 weeks, learning timing and release points with inert practice rounds. The first time he used a real bomb with a live fuse was March 1, 1943, attacking the Japanese convoy. He had no idea if the delay fuse would actually work under combat conditions. No one did. The technique had never been tested with live ordnance. That detail remained classified until 1968, when 5th Air Force records were declassified. Larner practiced the most revolutionary anti-shipping tactic of World War II. Using fake bombs, then led 9 aircraft into combat using the technique for the first time with no proof it would actually work. That's not bravery. That's faith in physics, and desperation mixed in equal measure. Another detail emerged in 2003 when Japanese naval archives were digitized and made available to researchers. The captain of the first transport, Larner, hit the vessel that split open and sank in 15 minutes, survived, and was rescued by a destroyer. His after-action report described the attack. He wrote that he'd never seen aircraft fly so low. He wrote that his gunners couldn't track targets moving that fast at that altitude. He wrote that the explosion came from inside his ship, not outside, meaning the bomb had penetrated the hull before detonating. And then he wrote something unexpected. He recommended that Japanese naval aviation adopt similar tactics immediately. Japanese command read his report, filed it, and ignored it. They never developed their own skip bombing program. Why? Because institutional resistance to innovation wasn't unique to American military. The Japanese Navy had invested heavily in conventional naval aviation. Changing doctrine would require retraining thousands of pilots, modifying hundreds of aircraft, admitting that current methods were inferior, easier to reject the report and continue existing practices. That decision cost them the war in the Pacific. American forces adapted. Japanese forces didn't. Innovation won. From a crop duster with a crazy idea to a technique that sank 212 ships and saved 170,000 lives from being committed to hopeless battles, Ed Larner proved that the best solutions often come from those willing to see problems differently, that institutional resistance isn't permanent when results speak clearly, and that courage means trying something untested because tested methods aren't working. He flew 88 combat missions, trained 85 pilots, changed naval warfare forever, and then spent 52 years crop dusting in Nebraska without telling anyone what he'd done. He died in 1997 at age 85. His family honored his request for silence until his passing, then quietly donated his medals to the National Museum of the United States Air Force. They're displayed now in the Pacific War exhibit, though most visitors walk past without reading the small placard explaining who he was. Maybe that's fitting. Larner never wanted recognition. He wanted to survive and go home. He did both. The skip bombing technique outlived him by decades and continues influencing anti-ship warfare doctrine today. Every low-altitude anti-ship missile, every attack helicopter flying nap-of-the-earth profiles, every strike aircraft doctrine emphasizing speed and surprise over altitude and precision, they all trace lineage back to March 1, 1943, when a Nebraska crop duster flew 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea and proved that sometimes the craziest ideas are actually the smartest solutions waiting to be tested. That's the power of innovation courage, and refusing to accept that 3% is good enough when 100% is possible. If this story moved, you share it. Larner's name deserves to be remembered alongside the techniques he pioneered. And if you know similar stories of forgotten innovators who changed history, tell them. These aren't just military tales. They're reminders that breakthrough solutions often come from unexpected sources, that institutional resistance is predictable, but not permanent, and that one person willing to challenge conventional wisdom can alter the course of events for millions. That's not just history. That's inspiration. Remember Ed Larner. Remember skip bombing. Remember that the next impossible idea might just be the one that changes everything.